Hello, this is Amitabh Ghosh, and I'm speaking to you from my home in Brooklyn, New York. It's a great pleasure to be speaking to my readers in Taiwan, and I'd like to thank Linking Publishers and particularly my editor, Victor Huang, for arranging this and making it possible. I've never been to Taiwan, and I was really looking forward to this to being there for this festival. Unfortunately, it was not to be because of the pandemic. Taiwan is a place that I find very interesting because it's so much a part of the wider Indo-Pacific world that I've been writing about for a long time, and it has these long connections with India and other parts of the Indian Ocean world. So it would have been very interesting to be there, and I'm very sorry to miss this opportunity, but I hope such an opportunity will arise again sometime in the future. So I'm going to answer some of the questions that have been sent to me. The first question is about plot and character and how you balance that against historical sources and the demand for historical accuracy. Well, I think a historical novel is fundamentally not very different from any other kind of novel, in the sense that first and foremost, it has to be a good story. And as with any other kind of novel, a historical novel demands good characters, it demands an interesting plot, and it demands, the same sort of force of storytelling. After all, no one is going to read a historical novel for the history. If the history is there, then it's it's a part of the background. It's something added on. It's not the main course, as it were. I think that's something that one has to keep very much in mind when one is writing a historical novel. And I particularly have always to keep this in mind because I love doing research. Research is much easier than writing. Because, especially for someone like me, I enjoy being in libraries, I enjoy finding primary sources, I enjoy that aspect of, the work of writing a novel. So it's very easy to get lost in the historical sources. It's very easy to just get taken away with the sources, especially when they're as fascinating as the sources were for the Ibis trilogy. So, I think the main and most important thing one has to do in that sense is that one has to allow the history to serve as a backdrop. And in this sense, I don't think writing a historical novel is that different from writing any other kind of novel again. I mean, imagine if I were to write a novel about New York, Again, in the case of New York, there are certain things that I would have to get right. I would have to get the climate right. I would have to get the layout of the streets right. I would have to get the geography right. I would have to get the history right, even if I were writing about today. And in that sense, I think it's not so different when you're writing a historical novel, because the same imperatives apply. You have to be careful to get all the facts in place. And for myself, I try to be very truthful to what actually happened, to what the sources tell us. And I think that's a necessary kind of discipline, and I've always found it very helpful, in fact, that, if you have a certain grid of facts, then it helps you plot your story. I don't think you have to make things up. And although my characters are almost all fictional, whenever there's an actual historical character, I try to be very careful to deal with that person truthfully, and to represent them as the history suggests. So, there are two things over there that you have to be careful with. One is that if the character is completely made up, then that character is like a character in any kind of fiction. You make stories about them, they act in your story. But if the character is actually a historical character, and in the Ibis trilogy, there are many, especially in the last book, Flood of Fire, there are many characters who are actually based on real historical characters, and with them you have to be a little more careful. You have to attend to their circumstances more carefully. So, the second question is that, let me read it out. The Ibis trilogy allows Taiwanese readers to hear voices aside from China and Britain. So, I think this is a very important point, because I came into the story from an Indian point of view. And to be honest, when I first started writing the Ibis trilogy, it was not going to end up where it finally did end up. But that's one of the exciting things about writing a novel. Novels take you into places where you don't expect to be. It's not like you start off knowing exactly where you're going to go. And I certainly didn't start off knowing exactly where this particular novel or these novels were going to take me. So when I began writing the Ibis trilogy, what I was really interested in was the stories of displacement and migration. Especially the migration of Indian indentured workers to Mauritius and Fiji and places like that. So that was the story that I really got started with. So characters like the central character Diti, they were the characters that initially, carried the novel forward, especially Sea of Poppies. But once I started getting into the researching the historical background and finding the sort of history that lay behind it, it became clear that the history was so complex and that all of it, in fact, pointed eastwards towards China. Because this was a novel, this entire project was really about the maritime world of the Indian Ocean in the 19th century. And the most important aspect of that maritime world was the connection between India and China. And the most important aspect of that connection was the opium trade. The opium trade forms the background to the entire Ibis trilogy. And, this was something I didn't know about really, because even though in China, people are very well informed about the opium trade and the effects it had on China in the 19th century. Outside China, and I'm sure this is the case also with Taiwan, in the outside world, there's very little awareness of the opium trade and the enormous role that it played in the 19th century and the 18th century, for that matter. There's absolutely no awareness of this. I mean, in India, I think, even very highly educated people, and, even someone like myself, until I started writing the Ibis trilogy, I had really no idea of how important the opium trade was for India's economy. And this came about as an aspect of colonialism. Really, what happened is that in the 17th and 18th centuries, England began to import very large quantities of tea from China, and it became an essential part of their commercial economy. A large part of the revenues of the British state in the 18th and 19th centuries came from taxes on tea. As you'll have heard about the Boston Tea Party, that was again because tea was so highly taxed within the British Empire. So Britain had to pay for its tea with silver, and at a certain point they began running out of silver. So they had, the leaders of the East India Company, who were based in Calcutta, sat down and tried to think of some way, some commodity that they could sell to China that would create a balance of trade. And in the end, they came up with opium. And for them, it worked. I mean, within a few decades, China was importing so much opium that the entire balance of trade situation reversed itself, and silver began to flow out of China. This is actually one of history's great crimes. It's one of the most terrible things that one can imagine. And really, the capital that accumulated from this opium trade, and this capital accumulated in multiple ways. It wasn't just that the Chinese were paying silver for opium. It was also that these payments were being routed through England. So the poor Indian peasant who was producing this opium, became poorer and poorer. They were producing this opium in forms that were incredibly exploitative. So they got nothing, but really this made a lot of British and American merchants very, very rich. It's one of the extraordinary things about this history that the people who were known as Boston Brahmins were really opium merchants. Really the whole sort of Boston economy, the whole sort of early capitalist economy of America was financed with money that came from China, from the opium trade. And there's so little recognition of this. Now, India played a very crucial role in this, in the sense that India was the country that was producing opium. And, that aspect of it tends to be forgotten. Certainly, there's no recognition of it in India. And it's even sort of elided within China, I think. So it was very important for me to try and find, what are the Indian responses to this? What is the Indian role in the Opium War? And the Indian role was huge. Indian merchants essentially financed the Opium War. They provided merchants from Bombay, which was the big opium trading city apart from Calcutta. Merchants from Bombay and Calcutta, provided many of the ships that fought the Opium War. They provided a lot of the financing for the Opium War. And of course, they also provided soldiers. About half the soldiers who fought in the Opium War were from India. This is a terrible history, and I feel that India needs to be better informed about this past. And I think in that sense, the Ibis Trilogy really did serve that purpose. It certainly created a new awareness of what this history was, an awareness of that had been lost to Indians. But it was interesting for me also to try and think of the role of ordinary Indians, who just found themselves caught up in circumstances over which they had very little control, especially the soldiers who were implicated in the Opium War. Many of them were, in fact, very sympathetic to the Chinese, but their stories almost never get told. So, history, as we all know, is a story told by the victors. But it's really in fiction that we get the opportunity to tell the story from the point of people who are neither victors nor vanquished, and which is the case with so many of these Indian soldiers. And that, for me, was a very exciting aspect of writing this trilogy. So the next question is, your latest novel, Gun Island, combines Bengali folk mythology and the history of Venice, and also reflects the immigration wave caused by regional turmoil and environmental disasters in the world. Yes, before I wrote Gun Island, I wrote a book called The Great Derangement. And The Great Derangement has a subtitle, which is Climate Change and the Unthinkable. It's a nonfiction book, and what I address in this nonfiction book is really the issue of climate change and why climate change has been so elusive to literature. Writers on the whole have not addressed climate change with the urgency that people have in other branches of the humanities, for example, no matter whether it be philosophy or whatever. So it was a question that I sort of addressed in the book, and I can't say that I came to many very particular answers, but certainly what doing the research showed to me is really how great a crisis the world is currently in. I mean, this is a crisis like the human species has never known. So it became a matter of great urgency for me to try and address some of those issues. And Gun Island really arose out of my engagement with these issues, because I suddenly began to see a completely changed reality that we often don't recognize for what it is. So for over many years, I've spent a fair amount of time in Venice, and I began to notice some 20 years ago, in fact, that a lot of the working class in Venice were actually Bengalis, mainly from Bangladesh. And since I am myself Bengali, it was a matter of great interest to me. And I began to wonder, why is it that so many Bengalis are ending up in Venice? And that was, in a way, the beginning of the story. Bengal is, as many of you will know, one of the parts of the world that's most threatened by climate change. And indeed, I would say many of the people who end up in Italy or Europe, they are, in fact, people who are displaced by climate change and by weather events. So, that is the sort of background of the story. The story is, at the end of the day, a story like any other story. So from readers, there's been a question that my books are usually about, they have a huge structure or a big issue. This is certainly particularly true of the Ibis trilogy. The Ibis trilogy was a gigantic project. It took me altogether 11 years to finish, and there was an enormous amount of research that I had to do for it, because a lot of the research actually hasn't been done by historians. There's actually no military history of the Opium War. So essentially, I had to get into the primary sources and essentially write the military history for myself. So that was really a sort of gigantic undertaking. I can't see myself taking up anything like that again in the near future. So there's another question about how, in the Ibis trilogy, the characters from many different walks of life. Some are higher rank, some are of lower class. They're male and female, and also some are not binary. And this is absolutely true. I think the Ibis trilogy is, after all, named after a ship. And one of the remarkable things about a ship is that ships contain people of many different kinds. There are the officers, there are the crewmen, there are women who are traveling in them sometimes, and there are the crewmen and so on. And in fact, in the 19th century, ships in the Indian Ocean tended to have extremely diverse crews. The crewmen would be from India, from China, from the Philippines, from Indonesia, from East Africa, from the Arab world. So they were in themselves a little world unto themselves. So yes, it was very exciting and very interesting to have this incredibly diverse field of characters. Another question here is about patriarchy and women. It's true that there are many female characters in the Ibis trilogy, and really the entire project began with a woman character who is Diti. Diti was really the character who carried especially Sea of Poppies forward, and she remained throughout the trilogy as a guiding spirit, a guiding light. And women often sort of are, of course, in many ways a very oppressed group in India and in South Asia in general, as in many parts of the world. But at the same time, in India as well, I would say that women often play a very powerful, if unseen role. And certainly they have in my life. So I've always found it interesting to write about women characters. The final question is about the epidemic. Well, as you all know, the epidemic has been terribly mishandled in America. Every day now, for the last few days, more than 4,000 people have been dying in this country, which is a truly shocking and unbelievable sort of outcome. It really didn't have to be like this. It just is incomprehensible why this has happened in this disastrous way. And it's not just in the United States. It's also in Britain and in India. And I think the themes of the Ibis trilogy have a real bearing on this, because in the Ibis trilogy, as you've seen, the opium traders, they put profit over all other considerations. And that is really what has also hampered these countries in responding to the pandemic. I mean, they were desperate to keep the markets open, to keep the economy going, as they kept saying. And so they never took the measures that they needed to. So in a way, really what we see within this pandemic is that history, the same history that created the conditions for the Ibis trilogy, the same history is manifesting itself in many different ways. Firstly, in this kind of pursuit, this kind of mad pursuit of profit on the one hand, and secondly, in this crazy sort of pursuit of individualism, across a large part of America, people simply will not put on their masks, which is kind of so unbelievable and so unnecessary. It's something that I call morbid individualism, because really, what do you gain by not putting on a mask? So it's kind of, it's that history, as it were, coming back to haunt these countries, and also India. India again has fared incredibly badly. So, we sit here, we read about Taiwan, where people are just back to normal, going out to dinner, going to parties, going to music concerts, and we keep wondering, when will this be possible for us? So in many ways, the pandemic really does represent, I think, a world historical shift. Just as the Opium War represented one kind of world historical shift, I think this pandemic is a sign of a sort of absolute change, a geopolitical shift on a massive scale. So let's see what the outcome is. For me personally, I must say this has been, despite all the difficulties and so on, I've just been shut away at home writing. And actually, for me, because I'm a writer, it's not so different from what I normally do. And in fact, it's been an incredibly productive time for me. I have 2 books coming out this year, in fact. One which I finished right at the start of the pandemic. It's a book called Jungle Nama. It's an adaptation of a legend, an Indian legend told in verse. And I've also got a book coming out called The Nutmeg's Curse. And this book is a sort of follow-up or a companion volume to The Great Derangement. And it's really about the history of the Indian Ocean and how our present crises are rooted in that history and the history of imperialism and colonialism. So it's been a great pleasure to be with you. Thank you again. And I wish I could be there in Taiwan with you, but I take this opportunity to greet all my readers in Taiwan. Thank you for inviting me to be with you, and I hope to be with you in person someday. Thank you very much.